So we keep going. All right, on to the population maps. Just kind of, again, to sort of show you what's going on. Where is the majority of the population, both in 1810 and 1820? Right, it's up here in the Northeast. But what kind of trend can you see happening between 1810 and 1820, which is only a decade? That's kind of a short period of time. Right, people are starting to move over to the west. Again, you don't have a ton of people, but you have starting to move in the westward expansion. That is kind of important for a couple of reasons. Number one, having the majority of the population up here in the Northeast means that the Northeast kind of rules the House of Representatives, because that's where representation is done by population. So that means that you've got a lot more guys in the House in the Northeast, which is why it was particularly important for Southerners to keep that balance of power in the Senate, so that you could have an equal number of slave and free states. Okay, that is what leads us over here to the Missouri Compromise. Remember, the Missouri Compromise is one of the compromises that puts off the Civil War. Missouri Compromise is in 1820. Civil War starts in 1861. So it's one of those things that forestalls the Civil War. Let's make sure that we understand the contextualization there. Things kind of leading up to the compromise, I would say one of them would have to be the Louisiana Purchase, because again, none of this matters if we don't have this territory. So TJ's Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And I would probably go ahead and say the Northwest Ordinance, which, what is that again? That's right, it's how a territory becomes a state. Good. We kind of went over this yesterday a little bit, so I'm going to sort of run through it quickly today. The two big important things about the Missouri Compromise. Number one, Missouri is admitted as a slave state. Maine is admitted as a free state. So you get to maintain that balance of power in the Senate. Still have an equal number of slave and free states. The second important thing is that there is no slavery north of this 3630 parallel, with the exception, of course, of Missouri. The idea, though, is that all this unorganized territory over here would be free territory. The problem comes, though, when we fight against Mexico. When Mexico gets its independence from Spain and we fight against Mexico and we wind up winning this entire territory over here, is all this territory then going to be slave territory? Hang on, that's coming up in the next unit. Another thing that I wanted to make sure to mention here is the Talmadge Amendment. Okay, Senator Talmadge stood up when they were doing the Missouri Compromise and offered an amendment to the compromise that said that all slaves born in Missouri would eventually be freed. First, any slave in Missouri would be freed when they got to be 25 years old. The second thing that he said was no more new slaves would come into Missouri. Okay, the South completely flipped the desk. Really freaked out about that and decided, no, we are never going to let that happen. So the Talmadge Amendment failed. But the important thing is about it that it freaked the South out. That now Southerners are really afraid that the federal government is going to legislate slavery, which makes them more and more entrenched in the idea that we have got to keep a balance of power in the South. We've got to keep a balance of power in the Senate. So even though the Talmadge Amendment failed, it completely freaked out Southern statesmen. All right, as far as critics of the Missouri Compromise, in the South, you had a lot of people hate it because it established the idea that Congress actually could legislate the idea of slavery. They could make laws regarding slavery because, again, they said no slavery below this line. No slavery above this line. So Southerners did not like it because they thought that it established that Congress could make laws on slavery. The North hated it because that it allowed for the expansion of slavery. Again, according to the Northerners, the idea of allowing Missouri in as a slave state, even though you got Maine as a free state, again, you're still allowing for the extension of slavery. The idea that you were allowed to have slavery south of this 3630 parallel, that was kind of an aberration for them, that they couldn't stand that because of how horrible they thought that was. As a spoiler alert, In the next unit, we have something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Obviously, Kansas and Nebraska, somewhere up here around the Arkansas territory, or slightly, I guess, west of the Arkansas territory. Both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott Act, both of them negate the Missouri Compromise. But again, it's one of those things that keeps peace for at least 30 years or so. Okay. You need to know this quote too. But this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. It is hushed indeed for the moment, but but this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. Anybody have any clue who this was? Good job. This is Thomas Jefferson, writing to a friend about the Missouri Compromise. He didn't like the Missouri Compromise. He basically said, look, the slavery issue, this is going to be the death of us. We are eventually going to fight because of the issue of slavery. We can't keep compromising about this one. Kind of prophetic, because I'm not sure if you know, but we did. We fought over this. It's called the American Civil War. All right. Henry Clay's America System. We did this a little bit yesterday, so I'm going to kind of run through it again today. All right. First one is the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. The charter had expired in 1811. Henry Clay desperately wanted to have a recharter of the bank. Infrastructure improvements, internal infrastructure improvements like the National Road, federal funding for canals, stuff like that. Honestly, it really only helps the North. But he sold it as something that would help all areas of the country. Just, again, it didn't really apply to the South. And then a really high protective tariff, which obviously the vast majority of Southerners hate. So the America System was intended to help the nation as a whole, but it really wound up only helping the South. Okay, again, I want to make sure that you saw things like Cumberland Road. Starts here in Maryland, eventually stretches all the way over to St. Louis. The Erie Canal, it actually wound up being paid for by the state of New York, but if Henry Clay had his way, it would have been paid for by the federal government. Again, we have plenty of rivers, roads, canals. Did kind of want to bring this up. As far as the West get the idea, they get roads, they get canals, they get federal, oops, I think I misspelled aid, whatever. The East got protective tariffs, particularly Northeast. The South didn't really get anything out of the American System, which is why it was kind of a hard sell in the South. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine. This is going to be the last thing that we do, and then I'll cover the corrupt bargain later. Monroe Doctrine stated that America was now closed to any further colonization from Europe. Again, this is a review. We did this one before. If Europe interfered with the sovereignty of any independent nation, we as America would consider it a threat, but we don't actually say that we would do anything about it because we can't do anything about it. Again, it's 1823. We're still a nation of cupcakes right now. Okay, so we'll talk about the corrupt bargain later. Y'all, good job. I really appreciate you sticking with me. And listen to yourself on the next part. Thanks very much.